Homage to the Triple Gem. So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm just here at Dharma-Pradipa Monastery in Welawaya, and I've been in this area looking around at different places to build a potential kuti, and was asked a question maybe about 2 months ago by a gentleman about dealing with arrogance. And so the question was basically, how does one overcome arrogance? How does one develop humility? And how does one practice in such a way that one doesn't feel condescending towards people who are not that spiritual? Just paraphrasing these questions, kind of. So arrogance can come essentially when one compares oneself to other people. And it often comes, especially for people in a Western context, in the context of competition. So in other words, somebody has noticed that somebody is good at a particular thing, and then they try to outdo them or go one higher than them or whatever it might be. And if they're successful in doing this, sometimes the person knows they're competing with them and sometimes they don't even know. Then that person develops a sense of superiority. Kind of, I'm a person who's superior to this person. And as a result of competing with people in these various qualities, both at times when people know and times when they don't know, they develop a ranking for themselves of where they are in the hierarchy of people in such and such a profession, in such and such a situation, whatever it might be. So a lot of this is deeply ingrained in people who've grown up in Western countries because they function on a model of competition. Now, the model of competition is not necessarily bad. I mean, it has good qualities to it, to be sure. Ideally, there's a level playing field. It's a meritocracy, and then the person who competes the best wins. And there's no barriers to entry, so it's just based on skill, and as a result, people get the best products or the best services from whoever is able to provide them the best. This is the kind of underlying attitude as it forms a foundation for a capitalist economy, which is the economy of most of what you might call the Western world, if not all. So this gets ingrained to people from a young age, especially people get trained in this through things like sports. I mean, there's rules, it's fair, you've got to compete, and the best person wins. May the best person win. And that's what they used to say, may the best man win, before the game started. Before the match started. So essentially this gets ingrained to people when from the time they're very young, and by the time they reach teenage years, adulthood, whatever it might be, it becomes a habit. And it not only becomes a habit for people to look at the world that way, it becomes a habit for people to spectate the world that way. For people to look at other people that way, not just in the regards to say the way that one is looking at other people in terms of competing with oneself, but when one looks at a group of other people, one might look at them and say, who's the best in this group? Right? And start to rank them according to who's the best based on whatever quality. So this is a way of looking at the world that can really permeate almost everything that one does, and almost many of the ways that one perceives. The trouble with it is that this way of looking at the world is something that is not generally praised by the Buddha. He calls it asmimana. It's a way of being conceited, basically. The conceit I am. The conceit I'm a person with these particular qualities. This conceit gets reified. It becomes more real when people engage in this competition. And just as an aside, it's kind of funny sometimes to see the way that people get into competitions this way, because as I'd mentioned earlier in the talk, sometimes the people they're competing with don't even know they're competing. This person's already set up a competition and they don't know. The other person doesn't know, or they don't even care. Actually, there was not long ago, there was this Vasa. I went to this monastery, and I started to notice this one monk. He was like trying to compete to eat faster than me. And so I had no interest in this competition. But I started to notice that he was trying to compete with me in various other things, and just basically trying to engage in quite a lot of competition. But the funny thing is when we start to compete with other people, and they're not even playing the game, they don't even know that the game is going on necessarily, or they don't care. Kind of who can eat faster than another person is that's not going to be a big leg up necessarily on who's going to attain Nibbana. So in terms of our Buddhist practice, a lot of these things are not necessarily relevant. And even if they are relevant qualities, this attitude of competition can get in the way. So the Buddha called it this conceit I am. So in other words, we compete with people. We establish that we have a quality at such and such a level, and we want to see if we're better than other people. We want to raise it up higher than other people. The thing is, when we compete with other people in this way, and we set ourselves in a hierarchy in this way, unthinkingly, what we do is we form a subtle opinion of who we are that can be very, very strong. I mean, you got good grades through elementary school, through high school, and you got a good job. That's going to form, that can potentially form a large part of a person's identity, a large part of how a person views their capabilities and how they view their ability to interact with the world and how the world should interact with them. So it becomes this lens, even subtly, through which people, again, see the world, and they expect the world more or less to see them. So the problem with this arrogance in terms of one's spiritual practice is, one of the big problems is, even if one is competing with people in a wholesome quality, say like, how many hours can you meditate, right? Like, or, we're going to do meditation. One guy's meditating 6 hours, and he's I'm going to meditate 7 hours, right? Or they're meditating, they're getting up at 4 a.m., you're going to get up at 3 a.m. Or they're getting up at 3 a.m., and it's like, well, I'm going to get up at 2 a.m. One of the things with competition is that it pulls people into other people's worlds. So in order to compete with somebody, you have to try to go higher than they are. And they may have different resources at their disposal at that time for their practice. You may be competing with somebody who's meditating now 8 hours a day or whatever it might be, a really long amount of, a good amount of time, the whole day they're meditating and trying to do one more hour than them. What you may not know is that years ago they'd spent a lot of time studying. They'd laid a foundation in study and learning the monastic rules and learning the Buddhist teachings, and now they're turning their attention to meditation. So if you're just starting out and you jump right in and say, well, I'm going to outcompete this guy, well, I mean, you don't even have the same foundation that he does. So it's not really an accurate thing it's not really an accurate judge of where you each are in terms of your knowledge of Buddhism, or necessarily even where you need to be. You've been pulled into the world of the person where they are now, but where you might need to be is at the point where you're studying rules, learning what the precepts are, learning the basic foundations of the Buddhist teachings. So competition with other people in a spiritual sense has the quality of pulling us into their world. And it might not necessarily be the best place for us to be. We may have a different path to walk. Another thing about competing with people, especially spiritually, is that it's large. Spiritual practice is something that is most powerful when it's done consistently. So if a person is just starting out in their spiritual practice, or they're 1 or 2 years in, and they see another person who's maybe like 15 years into meditation, and then they see that person's meditating, 6 hours a day, and they say, well, I'm going to meditate 10 hours a day. And so they meditate 10 hours a day, but they do it for 2 weeks. Well, if you add up the number of hours that both of you have meditated over the course of your life, there would be no comparison. It'd be like somebody coming up next to a person who's running a marathon and sprinting 100 meters and deciding they're a better runner because they beat them in this 100 meters sprint. But this other fellow's been running a marathon. He's already been running for, say like 20 kilometers or so. So, number one thing, it's not necessarily useful. You can get pulled into another person's world competing with them. It's also not necessarily accurate. It's notoriously difficult to judge other people's spiritual progress, to judge where they are in an absolute sense in their practice, in relationship to their ability to achieve Nibbana or the noble attainments or whatever it might be. It's actually really hard to tell who is somebody who's achieved a noble attainment and who hasn't. It's much more difficult than people would think. And it's even hard to tell who has jhanas and who doesn't. You might think that somebody who seems to be doing everything really, really mindfully, really, really slowly, like really on top of what they're doing, that they have excellent jhanas, and that somebody who does things very quickly doesn't. But if you're a monk, you get to know your fellow monks. And some monks are very, very mindful. They don't have access to the jhanas. Other monks, they may seem like they're engaged in a lot of teaching or a lot of work or whatever it might be, and they're skilled at all the jhanas. So it's not necessarily useful to set up some objective criteria like that you can compete with people on, and then decide that you're better, worse, or equal than them as a result of this competition. It's very difficult to judge where people are in their practice, and it's even difficult to judge oneself. So it's better not to do it, because it may very well be inaccurate, and even if it's relatively accurate, which can be reasonably rare actually, more rare than one would expect, it pulls one into another person's world and potentially away from what it is that one needs to be doing in one's own practice right now. So the cure for this arrogance, which stems oftentimes from competition in a Western context, is not to look at people in terms of their qualities and try to one-ups them. I'm a better meditator than this person, carte blanche, or one thinks to oneself, I'm further than this person on the path, something like this, is to look at people in terms of the good and bad qualities that they have. And again, this is different than a competition where one is setting it up like this is an absolute, this is it can become a subtle perception in one's mind. This is an absolute, this person is like this. What one looks at is what are the good and bad qualities this person has now, so that I can learn from their good qualities. So there's a sutta in the canon in which the Buddha says that if a person hasn't developed concentration, they should approach somebody who has and ask them, how do you develop concentration? And if they haven't developed higher insight into phenomena, they should approach somebody who's developed higher insight into phenomenon and ask them, how do you develop higher insight into phenomenon? This is a very powerful practice, can be actually, and it's powerful in more than just the information that people will give. It can create almost like a bond where you follow in the slipstream of people who you respectfully and sincerely ask for advice. Even if they're people who in a normal economic context you might be competing with. There was one time when I was a young monk, and I used to like to put forth effort. I considered myself to be like a disciplined person when I was young. And I went to this one monastery, and there was another monk. He was also Canadian. And we were almost the same vasa, just about 3 months apart. And he was much better than me, much more diligent than me. He basically never took breaks. It was always involved in some sort of constructive activity, something to do with effort. Wasted almost no time. And I was really inspired, really impressed. But because we were about the same level, about the same vasa, that's the type of situation where you can get into a competition. And so at first I did little competing with him, but it was nowhere close. And so eventually I remembered that sutta that the Buddha taught, and I decided that although we were on a little bit of we had a little bit of friction, that not a lot, but a bit of friction, that I would go up to him and I would just ask him, I'm really impressed, I'm inspired with the way that you put forth effort, and how do you do it? So I went to him and asked him, how do you do this? And the answer that he gave was, was fine. But after that, I got this kind of inspiration. What he's doing is he's basically devoting all of his time to putting forth effort, except when he interacts with other people. And it gave me this very strong inspiration and this kind of new model that I don't think would have penetrated, say, as deeply if I'd just been trying to suss him out as a competitor. And that model gave me quite a lot of inspiration for a long time, for many, many years. So this is a very powerful practice, to look at people not necessarily like there are competitors who are, competing for some scarce resource. That kind of thing can be true in the world because, there's only so much minerals, there's only so many, chairs, there's only so much reputation to go around. But spiritually, in terms of spiritual practice, the Nibbana element doesn't run out no matter how many monks attain Nibbana. So it's a situation in which there's more than enough, there's plenty of spiritual progress to go around, and another person's spiritual progress does not harm yours. In fact, if you associate with people who are doing well in their practice, your practice gets uplifted also. So it requires this change of attitude from one where we're trying to compete with people to be at the top of whatever hierarchy it is, to one where instead of looking outwards to be at the top of a hierarchy, we're looking inwards at our own good and bad qualities. And we're thinking, how can we overcome our bad qualities and develop our good qualities? When we have this attitude, that perception goes outwards. We look at other people's good and bad qualities, not to try to one-up them, but to try to develop the good qualities that they have. So it goes in a really different direction. It goes in a direction of respect. When you look at the good qualities that people have and try to take them on, the world becomes a brighter place. And you start to notice these good things about people that are praiseworthy, that are admirable, and that you want to take on. And this is a much happier way to perceive the world than one in which one is trying to one-up and compete with people. Actually, when one does this thing where one is like one-upsing, one's competing with people, the perception that tends to develop, if one is successful, is that one is like at the top of the world. Like looking down, like everybody else is not as good as one. And that is a kind of a dark place to be. So the Buddha, shortly after his enlightenment, he actually thought to himself, he who dwells without reverence, without somebody to revere, he lives unhappily. And the Buddha himself thought, now who can I dwell under, honoring and respecting him? So we can honor and respect people for their qualities, and in this way, arrogance goes down. Because we recognize that these qualities that we're developing, these are not something permanent. I mean, we're trying to develop them. They can fall away. We recognize the same about other people, and we learn to put aside absolute judgments about whether we're better, worse, or equal than them, and focus on developing our wholesome qualities, abandoning our unwholesome ones for the sake of Nibbana. Now, this is a path that the Buddha teaches that leads away from arrogance. It leads away from this comparison to form an absolute status, better, worse, or equal, and leads inwards, leads to one's own practice, to one's own mind, and away from this kind of reliance on defining oneself. And this is the arrogance, the conceit I am. One defines oneself as such and such a person. And whenever one does that, in order to maintain that perception, the world has to treat one a particular way. One has to be able to manipulate the world in a particular way to maintain this perception, I am. I'm this person with these qualities. So practicing in this way, one can abandon arrogance. One can develop humility, because humility comes in part when one knows that these things are not permanent, they're not stable within oneself. And also when one knows that one doesn't have the capacity of a Buddha to, say, judge other people, like to know their past lives, know what kind of karma they have, know what their future might be like if they continue on this course. I mean, people don't have that capacity. They don't know what roots are inside of people's minds. So one can have this humility. Even if one comes across a snake or an ant, we don't know. That ant could be a bodhisattva. It could be somebody who is actually more spiritually developed than us, or a being who's more spiritually developed than us. But because of the way that they're developing their paramis, they've taken birth as an ant. It could be that after their next birth as an ant, they get born as a human, even if they're not on a bodhisattva path, and they actually attain Nibbana before us. So people don't know. It's very difficult to judge. This is one of the things that was, reasonably, that comes across in the early Thai forest tradition. There's monks who are extremely inspiring. They're meditating in caves and, meditating huge numbers of hours. Some of them have psychic powers. And then a snake comes, like, ready to kill them, like to bite and kill them. And they speak to it, and they're like, basically they're talking to it, like, respectfully, like, I don't even know, you might have more parami than me. I'm still struggling against the defilements, and for all I know, you could, your parami could allow you to attain Nibbana before I do. So this is the kind of attitude that one can develop towards beings, towards all beings, that gives humility. I mean, obviously we don't want to emulate a snake in this lifetime, but we do want to emulate those good qualities that we see in people wherever we see them, those particular ones that are good. The ones that are bad we want to avoid. Now, there's a kind of a catch to this, in that a person can become a little bit naive if they over-apply this, because there are people who want to compete, and that means that what they want to do is actually they want to harm us. if we can find people who are kind, who are generous, who are respectful, and are looking for these situations in which it's +1, in which they win and we win, then those are the right people to go and to ask generally, how do we do this? I respect what you're doing. Some people are kind of hell-bent on, competing. So, you want to guard yourself. You want to be a little bit wise around those people. But I can say this. One would be surprised how many people one might think are like really strict competitors who would never talk about how they do things. And you go and ask them, and you say, I'm impressed with what you do, and they'll tell you. I think it's a kind of a human desire to help. Something kind of, really a bit instinctual, that when somebody says they're impressed with you and asks you how do you do it, then you want to tell them, you want to teach them. So in terms of not being arrogant towards people who are less spiritual, say, again, this ties back into not judging other people in an absolute sense. They may be a bum on the street now. 2 lives ago, they may have been an excellent monk. And if we're not careful, whatever spiritual practice we're doing now, we may end up like that in 2 lives, or next life, or this life. It's just very difficult to tell. If somebody has not become a stream mentor, there's nothing guaranteed, really, about what they're going to end up as. People do have their streams of karma, but if you don't know it, it's better to assume that it's not guaranteed, generally. So thinking in this way, one can abandon this kind of conceit towards people one perceives as being less spiritual, because we don't know what they were like before, we don't know what they'll be like in the future, and we don't know what we were like before, and we also don't know what we'll be like in the future. One of the qualities that conceit has, actually, is that it makes people complacent. When people think that they're really good, they're really special, they're really excellent, they're really spiritual, it's when they start thinking in this way that actually they're undermining the very qualities that, say, led them to feel that they were spiritual or competent or diligent. It's something really interesting that winning breeds complacency. Success tends to breed laziness. It's something really, really unusual about putting forth effort. So it can be good not to put all your cards on the table as well. If you feel like you're a spiritual person, and just be laying it all out, like how good of a meditator one is, or all of these spiritual experiences one has had. It may be better to hold that a little bit close to hand, and to behave in a humble way, because this will help one to generate more effort. And it also helps to tie into this attitude that, well, I don't know what will happen in the future, so I'd better be heedful. And that is an attitude that makes it much more difficult to disrespect other people that one feels are not spiritual. So this asmimana, this conceit I am, I am a person who can compete. I am a person who's at this ranking. I'm a spiritual person, one can think. I'm a person who can meditate for long hours while other people can't. This asmimana, this conceit I am, I'm better, I'm worse, I'm equal, is not praised by the Buddha. It's something to be put aside. And it's something to be replaced with a search for the good qualities that other people have, so that one can learn from them for the sake of advancing oneself towards Nibbana. Because the Buddha's path is not one that leads one to slot oneself into a hierarchy. It's something that goes beyond the 5 khandhas. It's something that goes beyond the creation of a self. It goes beyond I am. And when one is beyond I am, there's no comparing, I'm better, I'm worse, I'm equal. When one does not think this way, when one is free of these things, then this, the Buddha describes, for an arahant is the end of suffering. So we should set our minds on this goal, set our minds in this direction, and away from conceit, away from competition, and towards a goal that transcends them.